Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Music is Not a Genre's PODFAST. No physical comedy this week because of the hat. That's comedic enough, right? And you'll understand why I'm wearing this hat in just a little bit. Thank you, as always, for watching and listening. Listeners, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre to get a video for every episode of this podcast. Watchers, go to nickdimatteo.com/musicisnotagenre. If you'd rather not see this hat and just listen. And everybody go to patreon.com/@musicisnotagenre to support this podcast and my band Rec and everything I do. And I really do need your support. Take a moment to go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. Sponsor is Qobuz. Again, a high-res music streaming service. Costs about as much as Spotify or Apple. Has the same amount of music, but has great features. I think more interesting features than Spotify or Apple, in my estimation. And this week's topic for the 25th PODFAST is the parallel worlds of Philly and New Orleans. Those of you from Philly, maybe even New Orleans, might understand why I'm wearing this hat. So why this topic? Longtime fans might be aware that I am from Philly. And while I've been a New Yorker for 20-some years, Philly is still my home, city of birth, hometown, not home. And it's still my favorite city. My third favorite city behind Philly and New York is New Orleans, which as a musician and music lover and food lover makes a ton of sense. A few years ago, and I've been to New Orleans a couple times, I'd like to go more. Let's just say that. So, and I know Philly extremely well, or at least, fairly well, considering I haven't been there as much in recent years, but I've spent a lot of time there. And a few years ago, I started to notice a bunch of connections between those two cities. So I looked it up and saw that other people noticed those same connections. And I filed it away saying, I'm going to do an episode on this at some point. And then New Year's comes. If you know anything about Philly, every year on New Year's Day, there's the Mummers Parade, which I'll talk about soon. And it reminded me that this is a topic I need to get into. So here I am doing PODFAST 25 on the parallel worlds of Philly and New Orleans. I fleshed them out a little bit, just a little bit, for music and beyond. So, as you might see from the hat, the Mummers, this is a Mummers hat, Mummers Parade. Again, I'll explain that later. They bear a striking resemblance to Mardi Gras paraders. The flamboyance of it and the sequins and their feathers and things like that. And it goes beyond looks, the wildness, the music, the history. And I'm going to start with these parades as a touch point for both cities, since that's what woke me up to all the parallels. And then I'm going to go into other cultural things like food and architecture, general makeup, societal makeup, etc., who influenced, things. And I'll spend a bunch of time on, of course, the music, being music is not a genre, followed by some conclusions and a featured song and questions. So sources, Wikipedia, PolishAmericanStringBand.com, WHYY.org, which is the local public TV station in Philly, one of them. An article on muse.jhu.edu, Johns Hopkins, by Fareed Simpson Hankins, which led me to his YouTube series on Second Line Bebop. And if you want to know a lot about what I'm saying, watch his third episode on that. Mardi Gras, NewOrleans.com, and MummersMuseum.org. Disclaimers, though I love New Orleans, I'm going to be partial at times to Philly because I was born there, etc. If I still have family there. This is not a full history of the parades. It's not a full history of anything. It's a survey of some of the striking parallels. It's not a full history or deep music dive in either city. Again, it's about the parallels. I could do a whole episode on the history of music in Philly, and I may someday. And a lot of that has nothing to do with New Orleans. That won't be a part of this episode. It's just a survey of where the crossovers and similarities are. So let's get right into it. So the parades. The roots of both Mardi Gras and Mummers can be traced back to the 17th century in this country and even earlier in medieval European traditions. Mummers traditions are a bit older than Mardi Gras, but it's honestly hard to date because they're both kind of, well, they're both religious connected in one way or another. Parades for both started as the idea of visitation, meaning groups of performers would go from house to house with skits and music and poetry and etc. to earn food and drink. So, hey, I'll do something for you. Can I get a sandwich or whatever it was? Or I guess sandwiches didn't exist back then. They were both a celebration of life, one before a period of fasting and contemplation. That's Fat Tuesday, which in French is Mardi Gras, right before the Catholic tradition of Lent, which is those 40 days, I believe, before Easter when you're supposed to fast, etc. And then one at the end of the year to celebrate the previous year and usher in a positive way the new year, and that's the Mummers Parade. Speaking of Mummers, Momus, M-O-M-U-S, the god of satire, mockery, and poetry in Greek mythology, is what gives Mummers its name, and is also an integral part. Momus is an integral part of many Mardi Gras crews. And when I say crews, it's K-R-E-W-E-S. Crew is like it's a group of, paraders, an organized group. One of the original crews of Mardi Gras was founded by people who celebrated Mardi Gras in Mobile, Alabama. What's interesting is that celebration from time on was actually New Year's. So again, a parallel. And those people from Mobile, Alabama went to New Orleans to found and establish, again, one of the original crews and the general idea of parading, although the parade didn't take hold until a little bit later, but the celebration of Mardi Gras at least. And the interesting thing there is, before they were in Mobile, they were originally from Philadelphia. So that's in the 1830s. And they might even have been mummers themselves in Philadelphia, which is what led them, whatever reason, they decided to go to Mobile and start that, and from Mobile to New Orleans. So there is a direct connection. And there's a chance that a lot of Mardi Gras tradition was influenced first by the mummers from Philly, although I'm sure there was some parallel existence there. Side note that also Galveston, Texas is another of the big Mardi Gras cities, so Mobile, Galveston, New Orleans. Mardi Gras Indians crews and mummers clubs, at least the string bands and fancy divisions, both spend all year making feathered costumes that look nearly identical. And that one of the things that struck me, like, this is like Mardi Gras, but in the dead of winter. Mummers Parade is actually America's oldest folk parade. Started in 1901. 124th year this past year. We're going to attend the 125th. I haven't been to the parade in a really long time. I used to go every year as a kid. My grandmother would have huge parties at her house, which was 4 blocks from the parade route, and we would go and see it and then go back and have food and drink, etc. Haven't done that in a very long time. We plan to see it at the end of this coming year, or the beginning of the next year, I guess you would say. The only years they missed the Mummers Parade in 124 years was 1934 because of the Depression, and 2021 because of the pandemic. And mummers often mock or point out social issues. Mardi Gras often brings up social issues. This is another connection. The general revelry, costumery, drinking, especially the music, being such a huge part of both. That can't be said for all parades. There's some music in parades to a degree. It's just, window dressing or other things, but it's not as integral a part of many parades the way it is for Mardi Gras and mummers. I think Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, floats is the main thing there. Music is huge, sure. The Rose Parade in California, flower floats, huge. Music is there, but again, not as big a part. It's interspersed. This further points out that New Orleans and Philly are both true music towns, unlike New York City, and more on this later. And yeah, I live here, but I'm still going to say that about New York City. By the way, just so you know, for mummers, there's 5 divisions. There's the Fancy Brigade, String Band, Comic, and Wench. And the first 3 are the ones that are really flamboyant and more organized and choreographed and have amazing costumes, and the other two are more, again, comic and kind of jokey. But both of those capture some of the spirit that New Orleans itself has. Some other culture besides those parades. Philadelphia was founded in 1682 by William Penn. La Nouvelle Orléans was founded in 1718 by Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville, which, you pronounce it better. We know that New Orleans is a strongly French city. I think the only other big city in this hemisphere that's more French is probably Montreal. But correct me. Since Philadelphia was one of the main hubs for the colonies and developing independent country, and anyone not from Boston might say it was the hub. Hello, Bostonians. And it was actually the capital of the country for a bit, Philly. Again, unlike Boston. But this is not about Boston. I digress. Lots of the thinkers and architects of the USA lived and worked in Philadelphia, and they learned a lot from the French Enlightenment and were so inspired by it that it influenced Philadelphia politics, design, art, and culture, in no small part to the fact that the French who assisted us in the Revolution had strong ties to Philly as well. I'm blanking on the name of the main, Lafayette. As Lafayette went to Philly. You can see this French influence in these examples. The Benjamin Franklin Parkway was a huge, thoroughfare in Philly, was modeled on Paris's Champs-Élysées. Philadelphia City Hall exemplifies second French Empire style. The Academy of Music, one of the greatest in the country, was designed by Frenchman Napoleon Lebrun. Collections of Rodin and other 20th century French artists here in Philly are the most extensive outside of France in the entire world. And every July 14th, Philadelphians mark French independence. Is that Bastille Day? Whatever. Enthusiastically mocking Marie Antoinette with cries of "Let them eat tasty cake." And if you're from Philly, you know why tasty cake is of importance. Speaking of food, both are huge foodie towns that pride themselves on having great food at all tiers. Cheap eats. You can find great food, up to gourmet dining and everything in between. And nowhere is this more evident than in their long sandwiches. So Philly has what? Hoagies, cheesesteaks. I'm so hungry right now. I just realized how hungry I am. And New Orleans has po' boys and muffalettas. Clearly they're related. Though they're different, both were heavily influenced by Italian culture. One by mainland Italy, one by Sicily. Still Italian culture. In other places, they're known as subs, heroes here in New York City, grinders. It was striking to me when I was in New Orleans how much Italian influence there is in that city in general and how many Italians there are in general. And though all cities, of course, have Italians and most of them have a little Italy, the influence seems much more widespread in New Orleans and Philly than in other places. Something even, and I say that with a bias, and yet people from other cities who have visited Philly and New Orleans have commented on how strongly Italian those cities are. Both, especially Philly, both saw lots of Italians emigrating there in the second half of the 19th century. Again, New Orleans was mostly Sicilians, and Philly was mostly southern Italy. And by the 20th century, both had sizable Italian populations. Most of those people faced heavy discrimination, especially the ones with darker skin. And this is something I've mentioned before, but it's the Italians are a perfect example of how people turn on each other. So we have this debate, this ongoing debate about immigration, right? Who belongs here, who doesn't? And most of the people who are debating, all of the people really were not, their ancestors were not from this country, because who was? Other than Native Americans, and even then you could say they came over from the Bering Strait and all that stuff. But they were here first by many, many years, of course, and it was their country. But anyway, we're all immigrants to some degree or another, and every set of immigrants to a certain point was discriminated against. There was a period where Italians and Irish were so discriminated against that they weren't allowed in certain restaurants and things like that. Now, that passed, and I'm not saying that any of us have a hold on what it feels like to be discriminated today, but that's kind of my point, being that we assimilated into the white culture, let's say, and very quickly turned our backs on other immigrants. So, oh, you're Italian, you're not, Latinx. And that's a huge thing in my family. Don't tell me that I look Spanish or Mexican or Puerto Rican or Dominican or whatever. I'm Italian, And I was like, what different? Why does that bother you so much? But it bothers me that so many Italians have ended up being conservative when they came from a place of not quite as difficult discrimination, but pretty rough discrimination for quite a while. A side note, by the way, people who say Sicilians aren't Italians are either ridiculous or Sicilian. Because come on. I get there are differences. I get that. I get there are differences in northern Italy. But come on. But this is not, again, an episode on Italians. Of course, lots of Italians mean lots of both food and music. Think Louis Prima from New Orleans, and let's say Mario Lanza from Philly, among many others, including my dad, Nicky DiMatteo, who was a huge hit in Philly for a while. Which brings me in a second to music, but first, just a couple of other tidbits from culture. I hit the mic. St. Catherine Drexel was from Philadelphia, and that name is huge in the city. My brother works at Drexel University. She founded that. She founded a school in New Orleans, and they were both founded to help educate the poor and people of color, specifically Black and Native Americans. Both the Drexel in Philly and Xavier University in New Orleans still exist, and they're still doing well. Both cities played a major role in boat building for World War II. Philadelphia architect William Strickland designed mints, the Philadelphia Mint, for both cities in the early and mid-1800s. Philly still has a mint, New Orleans does not. Which brings me to the main thrust here, and that is the music and some history. And you'll notice through this section that Black culture has been the hugest part of their shared music history. So, Francis Johnson, born in Philly in 1792, was the first Black musician to get his music published in the United States. Also had one of the first touring bands, which went as far as Buckingham Palace. The band would take popular melodies of the day and do variations on them. What does that sound like? Jazz. That is a foundation of jazz. So it's a pre-jazz jazz. So thus, there's a connection right there to New Orleans. During colonial times, Philadelphia had the largest population of free Black people. Congo Square existed in both cities. These were places, squares, where free Black people could gather to practice music and dance and drumming and talk about things and just have like community gatherings. Music as an expression has been a part of both city traditions since the beginning. Both are music towns. Now, so, okay, what does that mean? I mentioned that before. Of course, there's music in every city. Yeah. Pretty much everywhere else in the world. Yeah. Some cities are known for being more enthusiastic about music, and in particular original and local music, and throwing much more support towards its musicians and music creators than some other cities. Both New Orleans and Philly are very supportive of their musicians, of their homegrown musicians, even of visiting musicians and of original musicians. Now, I'm told also Naples, Liverpool, Glasgow, and Dublin are very much like this, and I've got to go to all of them now, basically, among others. I would contend that many UK cities are supportive of musicians because the country as a whole is more supportive of music of all kinds. It might also be true of, say, Memphis and Minneapolis. I don't know those cities well enough, and I'm not saying that Philly and New Orleans are the only two cities in the country that are super supportive of musicians. I'm far from saying that, but they're the ones I know. So how does that differ from places like New York and LA and Nashville, which I don't call music towns, where so much of music we know has actually been created and disseminated? They are music biz towns. They're the music business towns. Does that mean great music isn't made here? No, it doesn't, because I'm here and I'm making great music, and so many other people I know are making great music. So it's not about great music is being made everywhere. It's the tenor of the city. New York, LA, and Nashville are not great for musicians. They're not very supportive of musicians. They are harsh. They are overly competitive. They expect you to do a lot of things either for free or you pay. They're focused more on money than art, and they lean heavily towards established music and music acts Again, those who have quote unquote proven themselves, rather than trying to support and uplift new artists, original artists. Having played both New York City and Philly and once in New Orleans, I can say that Philadelphia audiences pay much more attention to unknown music than New York audiences do. Maybe because New York's saturated and they're used to it. I don't care what the reason is. It still sucks. And though I, again, only played New Orleans once, I went to enough clubs to see the same kind of appreciation for music and the same kind of support for the musicians. So let's get into some more tangible ways Philly and New Orleans music are connected. Jazz is a huge one. Both were seminal in its development. Both had brass and drums as the foundations of their music. With New Orleans, it was the trumpet, and Philly, it was the saxophone. Think Louis Armstrong. Think John Coltrane, who's from Philly. Lots of jazz artists came through Philly or stationed themselves in Philly, including Dizzy Gillespie. It was a huge jazz town, and in some ways still is. If you're familiar with New Orleans, you know Preservation Hall. It was founded in the 1960s, still one of the best places to see jazz in the city. I loved it. The founders were Alan and Sandra Jaffe, who loved jazz and went to New Orleans to see it, but were disheartened to find it was dying out. So they founded the first New Orleans Society for the Preservation of Traditional Jazz. Not the first. They founded the New Orleans Society for the Preservation of Traditional Jazz. Didn't last. So instead, they bought an old art space and started having shows there, and that's what became Preservation Hall. It's still there. It's currently run by their son, Ben. And the Sandra and Jaffe and Alan and Sandra Jaffe from Philadelphia. Meaning at least one way, Philly was seminal in making sure New Orleans kept its connection to jazz alive and vibrant. It wasn't the only thing, but it played a huge part. That's a huge connection. Other kinds of music. Hit the mic again. Gospel. Mahalia Jackson is from New Orleans. She formed an alliance with Thomas Dorsey, who's often called the father of gospel music. But he always said the true father was Charles Tindley, who's from Philly. Now, Charles Tindley is known as the grandfather of gospel music and probably its true originator. And he built a Methodist church in South Philly, only a few blocks from where I was born and where my father grew up. He wrote many main gospel songs. By and By is a mainstay in Mardi Gras. So a Philly guy wrote a mainstay song for Mardi Gras. I'll Overcome Someday, which was the basis for We Shall Overcome Someday. Philly also has the African Methodist Episcopal AME Church, the AME, first church to incorporate trained choirs into its service. Marian Anderson was born in Philly. Paul Robeson was born in Princeton but lived most of his life in Philly. Both of their homes are now museums. So gospel, boom. Beyond gospel and jazz, there's soul, there's funk, there's R&B, all huge parts of both cities, undeniably so. Hip-hop is vibrant in both from the get-go. Philly's hip-hop started a few years earlier in the late 1970s, and Philly in general has had far more influential hip-hop stars, but New Orleans, holds its own. Both hip-hop traditions have very upfront and distinct rhythmic styles. Both are less straightforward than places like New York City rhythms and things like that. Both cities have important educational hubs for young musicians. Philly has the Creative and Performing Arts High School. Boyz II Men went there. Christian McBride, Questlove, Jasmine Sullivan. New Orleans has New Orleans Center for the Creative Arts. John Baptiste, Wynton Marsalis, Terrence Blanchard, Harry Connick Jr. all went there. And of course, there's the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia. There are so many notable musicians from both cities, and many of whom are my favorites. I'm not going to go through and mention them, and just to say that the music culture of many kinds of music is so vibrant in both cities. And I will say this a little bit later when I talk about the featured song. The prominence of a strong beat, a beat that is groovy, is something that is common in both cities that you will not find in every city. So some conclusions. Yes, of course, the cities are different in many ways. And of course, cities near water and in the United States will have certain similarities by default. Of course, these cities share characteristics with other cities. Like somebody said online, Naples, Dublin, Glasgow, whatever, Liverpool. But the similarities between Philly and New Orleans are more and more striking the more I see them. The more time I spend in both cities, the more I feel it. In fact, I challenge you to go to both cities and see what I mean, because I believe that if you do that, you will feel it too. Because both of these cities are considered kind of second cities to bigger ones like New York, LA, Chicago, they both have a bit of an underdog mentality. People from these cities are both fighters by nature and also might be made to feel a bit lesser, inferior. Though, of course, not lesser than fucking Boston. I'm talking about you, Boston. Yeah. You hear me? I'm from Philly. It's okay. This is not about Boston. That said, Philly is usually either the fifth or sixth largest city and was once the largest in the country and was once its capital. So I think its underdog mentality hurts more because it's closer to the top. And right now it's behind only New York, Chicago, LA, Houston, and Phoenix, and often switches places with either Houston or Phoenix, and has risen as high in my lifetime as the fifth largest city. New Orleans is currently 53rd largest, so a lot smaller, but it's been through so much. To talk about a fighting spirit, my God. And the fact that it still hasn't been supported the way it needs to be supported, fighters. Funny enough, New Orleans is 53rd and Cleveland is 54th, where my son goes to school for music. Both Philadelphia and New Orleans have much more of an amalgam approach to music. Most artists from these cities have styles that are harder to pin down because they mix up so much. There are certain sounds that you get from other cities that have their own sort of amalgam, but they're distinct in other ways. I would contend that Philly and New Orleans are even more mixed up than those. And I would also contend that everyone from both of these cities is at least a little bit funky. And you cannot say that about every city, including New York. A lot of great people here, a lot of great musicians. Not everybody here is funky. Finding it hard to find a good drummer. Let's just say that. Featured song. Speaking of my music, nothing I've done sounds like traditional New Orleans music. I don't know that you would say what I do sounds like Philly music, because I don't know what people say that music sounds like. But the point is that both cities are so into mixing genres that I vibe with both of them almost equally. Lots of what I do mixes things, you know that. And most of it is in some way funky or has a distinct beat that in some way you can groove to. This song that I've chosen as the featured song is called Deal, and it's from the Metrogrande sessions. It's a pretty decent example of mixing rock, kind of glitchy psychedelic, funk, and pop. At the time, I was not 100% happy with the production, but in hindsight, I think it captures an aesthetic of that period, and it's a generally solid song, and it moves and it grooves. Summary of the lyrics, the main line, you better know how to deal with love. I'm sure this was inspired by like Beck and other white, funky people, but it's basically a cautionary tale, somewhat negative. Love is good, but it's scary and slippery and tough to handle, and be careful. It's worth it, but it's going to take some effort. Though I don't know if I thought it was worth it when I wrote the song. You be the judge, because it's going to play in the next 30 seconds. Questions: are you familiar at all with either city? Are they among your favorites? You ever been there? Do you not care? Do these connections ring true to you? Are there other connections I missed? I'd love to know your answers to all these, because my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you for hanging with me for this PODFAST 25. Cannot wait to get this hat off my head, and I will talk to you next week.